Journalism has never been an easy profession. Reporters bear witness to some terrible things in the course of doing their jobs, and those things leave a mark. For generations, journalists have largely coped with these traumas on their own, sometimes self-medicating or often collectively gathering over sympathetic drinks with colleagues at the pub. But the stressors journalists face have been amplified in recent years. Cheered on by unscrupulous politicians and demagogues, people have become more brazen about attacking reporters directly while working in the field in both verbal and physical confrontations. And social media have made opportunities to attack and harass journalists so much easier and more anonymous. I'm Michael Depp, editor of TV News Check, and this is Inside the Media, the show that looks at the business of the news and the people who make it. This week, we're going to look at how journalists' mental health suffers in the course of doing their work, the dynamics worsening that problem, and efforts underway to help them through it. Today, I'm joined by Dave Seglins, a journalist with CBC in Toronto who is now also the organization's well-being champion. We'll explain what that means in just a few minutes. I'm also joined by Cait McMahon, a psychologist in Melbourne, Australia, where she was also the founder of the DART Center Asia Pacific of Columbia University. She has been a consultant specialist in the area of journalists and trauma since the early 1990s. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cait, you've been studying the effects of trauma on journalists' mental health for decades. What were those effects typically when you started looking at this issue versus how journalists are being impacted now?
Well, Michael, when we first started looking, we were looking very much at what we call primary trauma. So it would be, journalists going out into the field and seeing a car crash or a deceased child or war correspondent. And we'd look at the primary effects that would come from that type of exposure. Things have shifted incredibly in the last 20 years, and mainly due to social media and online operations. So with that has come online harassment, trolling, and also user-generated content that journalists are experiencing visually as well. So visual exposure online. And so the area has had to shift to take that sort of impact into account. Also the issue of what we call moral injury, which is another overlay.
And what is that?
So moral injury is where it was coined by Jonathan Shea, a psychiatrist mainly dealing with veterans. And in that time, Jonathan looked at people who were forced to breach their own moral compass by a directive from above. Then Brett Litz took it a little bit further and looks at where people choose to do something themselves, which actually breaches their moral compass. So they choose because of the pressure of the job or because of ego or because of a number of factors. So we're now looking at journalists who are not necessarily exposed to graphic content, but are thrown into situations where they're forced to do something that really breaches their moral compass. So an editor that might say to a young journalist, do not come back without that interview of that deceased and grieving family that had the deceased 2-year-old. And for some reason, that journalist feels that that's abhorrent to them, but they do it because of the job. And that would be a situation that would be what we would regard as moral injury.
So this job has always been tough on one's mental health, but things have changed pretty dramatically in more recent years. You've described a kind of perfect storm of circumstances that came about to worsen things for journalists. So what went into making that perfect storm right now?
Sure. Look, I think definitely COVID has, I don't know whether COVID has just exposed a lot of the issues or whether it's been a causal effect, but COVID has certainly in Australia, exposed the exhaustion of people to the job. The leaner newsrooms now, certainly in Australia, we've had cutbacks, and so you've got less people doing more. Then we've also got misinformation, disinformation, attacks on journalists, the change in society in terms of the view of journalism, where once, I mean, journalists have always been sort of attacked, certainly in Australia, but it's become incredibly vicious with the polarisation of societies the world over, I think. So there's been a real twist in the impacts of this type of stress and trauma on journalists, I think, as part of that perfect storm.
So, Dave, you're a TV, online, and radio investigative reporter for the CBC, most recently as a guest host for its national show, As It Happens. I suppose now is as good a time as any to explain how your job expanded to include well-being champion and what exactly that means.
Well, because I asked. Look, this is over a career of 25 years. I've had my own run-ins with exposure to horrible stories. I've also experienced this moral injury that Cait speaks of. And I've also been living through, COVID and I think there's just information overload. We're all feeling it, not just in the media. The acceleration and pace and the multiple platforms, like the stresses within the industry have escalated. So I got interested in this because it was affecting me and it was affecting my colleagues. And so I said to my people at CBC, we need to get better at this. And so they said, okay, well, go off and, what do you think we need? So I started calling news organizations around the world. I started looking for best practices. I went and took some courses on trauma and mental health. And so I've created this little bit of expertise within our news service. And so I pitched a job and I said, look, I don't know what to call it, but I'm going to call it well-being champion. I still want to be a journalist, but I also want to elevate the discussion and bring greater literacy into our newsrooms. And they went for it.
In your experience and in the experience of your colleagues, how has the toll this job is taking gotten worse?
Well, again, I think it's about the pace, the work demands, the fewer resources. Those are certainly stressors. I just came from a training session today where it's new for CBC to be doing this, but I went and did a mental health and stress module within our hostile environments training for the people who go to conflict zones. In preparation for that, we do this specialized training. Most major news organizations will do this. But now we're adding a component of the mental health. And we sat there, and one of my exercises is, let's name the stresses in our job. And boy, does that open a can of worms for journalists who just love, we don't often in our jobs or our workplaces get time to reflect on it. But it's everything from the pace to the deadlines, to the multiple deadlines now, because we're all filing for online, we're all filing for TV or radio, and sometimes multiple times in a day if it's a developing story. And the pressures we're under in the eyes of the public, the scrutiny, we've always been under scrutiny. It's always been important to be accurate and fair and balanced. But in the context of the polarization of politics, and the hatred against the mainstream media and the increase in harassment we're seeing, all of these things are coming together to be an extra burden. It's like a perfect storm for journalists. And I think Cait is quite right that COVID, it didn't matter if it was in the news industry, everywhere, we were all confronting mental health in a brand new way. And it really forced the news industry, which for a long time has been all about suck it up, it forced us to actually pause and reflect and realize, okay, we're going to have to get better at this.
And on the side of attacks, can you share some examples of abuse or targeting that the folks at the CBC may have suffered and how that played out, just to give a really specific picture?
Boy, so I'm doing research, talking to all sorts of journalists across the industry. So this isn't specific to CBC, but for instance, we did actually have a CBC reporter who was live on air one night, and some guy comes up behind him and sticks his tongue in the guy's ear and starts making these funny signs, while he's live on television. So that kind of just gross, bizarre harassment to the phenomenon. And I don't know if, and I will excuse my language, but the phenomenon of people stepping into the shot when women broadcasters are live on television and they scream out this obscenity of effer right in the blah, blah, blah. So those are kind of examples that my colleagues have been living through. Driving a marked van now in some parts of our country, Canada, we're now starting to see news organizations strip the decals off their van because I know of a colleague who had somebody cut them off, jump out of the car, start yelling and screaming at them. So that's some of the physical harassment. And then we go to the online and the kind of vitriol that is coming from largely anonymous Twitter accounts and targeting predominantly women and racialized journalists and media workers. It's really horrific. And there's been a real breakdown in all civility or respect for the fact that, the journalists are just people doing their jobs. It has become very heated and very threatening and very harmful to the people on the receiving end.
Hey, does this track with your experience in Australia? Is it fair to say that this is sort of a global phenomenon at this point?
It certainly is. I'm nodding away as Dave's speaking because it's certainly happening in Australia, exactly the sorts of things that Dave is speaking out of. But I also know it's happening around the world and certainly in our Asia-Pacific region. Maria Ressa, the recent Nobel laureate, has been tracking misinformation, disinformation and trolling, certainly for herself, but right across the journalism spectrum. And it's immense. It is in the trolling factories that are out there. The deliberate attacks on journalists are immense. As Dave said, the sexualised, the racialised, it's happening in Australia, happening right across the world. Journalists everywhere are experiencing this.
So is it true that things have gotten so bad that people are basically walking away from the profession, which historically speaking, that would be pretty unusual, right?
We're certainly seeing that anecdotally. I know that in Australia. I haven't seen any research to that end at the moment, but certainly know anecdotally journalists that I know of are just saying, look, I've had enough. I just can't do this anymore. And there's not the support. The organisations, thank goodness for CBC and a few other organisations, ABC in Australia and a few others, but there's the lack of support. And we know that journalists can bear a lot if they get appropriate support from those higher. So there are certainly people walking out the door here.
Cait, it's not just reporters out in the field who are hit by these acute stresses, but they're newsroom managers too. Why? How are they being impacted?
Look, I think there's a whole reckoning that has to happen in the industry, not just about stress, but about what is the media now in this new polarisation of the world, global polarisation, really. So I think these stresses, managers who have moved up the ranks, usually from working journalists up into the field, haven't really been trained in management strategies, how to manage people, but are just going by the seat of their pants. They're taking the responsibility of sending people out, of overseeing people who are experiencing these sorts of stresses, these sorts of traumas, and they often just don't know what to do. So not only are they getting from the editor and further up, the publisher, directives and stress from that, very work-related stress, but then there is this fear and this lack of understanding of how to deal with staff who are experiencing these not new, as Dave said, but these incredible sort of traumas, really. So lack of information stress, if you like, lack of knowledge, and not having that sense of mastery of how to manage their staff.
Of course, to be fair to them, nothing out of the past 3 years has really been in any handbook for management, right? I mean, we're talking about some extraordinary circumstances that nobody would be fully prepared to handle. So somebody somewhere is watching this discussion and they're thinking, what snowflakes these journalists are. A lot of jobs are hard. Why can't they just suck it up? So Dave, what do you say to that person?
So I'm going to challenge that a little bit because no one said that to my face. They might say it on Twitter where they're anonymous, but I don't really hear that from what I'll call real people, meaning people who are willing to sort of confront people in the normal way that we do have, normal discourse. I do hear people surprised at times. I've begun writing and speaking about this and trying to draw attention more to speak to my peers and my industry But people outside the industry go, oh yeah, I guess I never thought about that. That's right. You are sort of first responders. You're kind of racing to the scene along with the emergency personnel kind of. I never really thought about that you could be experiencing vicarious trauma. And so, you know, sure, if people want to dismiss this as a concern, fine. You know, I think that people do have legitimate concerns about the role of the mainstream media and what a monopoly it has had historically and what it continues to have on information. And we in the mainstream media have a really big job to do to ensure that we are getting at truth and accountability, being transparent so that people can trust us. I think we have a major trust problem. But when it comes to attacking the individual journalists, I don't have a lot of time for it. And what I would say to somebody who thinks we're snowflakes is just, you know, walk a moment in somebody else's shoes. You know, we're people. We're doing a job according to a code and set of standards, which may be old school for you. Maybe you want to see the media change, fine. But we're driven by a sense of public duty and serving the public. And so if you've got issues with the mainstream media, make sure you're not taking it out on, you know, the individuals who are just, you know, like everybody else. We've got bills to pay and we're doing our jobs.
Cait, what is it that makes the job of a journalist uniquely hard relative to, say, somebody in the police, a fireman or a paramedic who's routinely exposed to things that can have a traumatizing effect?
Yeah, look, years and years ago, I did some research that looked at, in part, at that issue. And what I still think is true today is the issue of identity. A cop goes out or an ambulance officer goes out and they have a very defined role that they have to play when they go out to the scene of an accident. A journalist is there to observe and to witness and to document. And that can be a very, very awkward thing. I know journalists in my study didn't know whether they should, if they were first on the scene, should they be applying CPR? What does that mean in terms of their role? If they do, some journalists did, some journalists didn't. And interestingly, I found the journalists that were in the middle, that were sort of flummoxed about that, were the ones that experienced more trauma impacts rather than the ones that had a clear identity that as a human being I should help, or as a journalist I should not. So I think there's that identity issue, that role issue that's different for journos, which is different for ambulance and police, certainly. And also, as Dave's been pointing out, like the perception of the community when someone walks past a police uniform or an ambulance officer. It's happening a little bit more, unfortunately, in Australia, where there are attacks that are and abuse getting thrown at those people, but certainly not as much as a journo and a camera operator that are standing out the front of a court, say, who now get physically bashed with chairs and all sorts of things. So I think there's that twofold thing of the personal identity that comes with being a journalist and understanding what that means for me as a journalist, and also the external perception from the community also of journalists.
And Michael, if I may, I want to jump in there too. There's also this phenomenon, you know, the most recent history of journalism has been defined by this idea of objectivity, right? Which is actually under great consideration because it's sort of written out of, you know, journalism, the lived experiences of all sorts of people, whether they be racialized, whether they be women, you know, like it. But the notion of that a lot of journalists have gone in is that the story's not about me. I'm not part of the story. I write myself out of the story. So when we get into, you know, covering people's trauma, we think, well, this couldn't possibly affect me because it's about the other person, and I'm going to write myself out of this. And relative to their trauma, I have no moral right to feel down myself because this poor person has had the worst day of their life and one of their relatives have died. And we do this moral relativism where we think we're not entitled as journalists to feel about the things that we're covering. And I think that's under reevaluation. I think we are naive to think that we go into, a lifetime of covering other people's trauma to not think that we come out of that with some emotional scars and baggage of our own. And so I think there is there's a really important discussion that we need to have collectively as an industry about what that looks like and what our responsibilities are to each other if this is what we're going to do for a living.
So Dave, you convinced the CBC to create your position in part because you looked around the news industry and you were largely disappointed by a lack of resources to help journalists who are traumatized. So typically, what sort of help is available to them now?
Well, traditionally, we have had an EAP, an employee assistance program. So, and what that means is our managers for a long time have said, well, if you're being negatively affected by the work, go get counseling at the EAP. There are some problems with that. That has deflected the responsibility of having to plan for difficult stories and to do proper check-ins during difficult stories. It was sort of like, well, if you get injured, go deal with it outside of work. It's like an afterthought. So we're starting to reevaluate how we assign, how we monitor our people so that we're having a bit more of a conversation throughout so they feel more supported. That's one thing that is starting to change. The other supports, we have medical benefits. We're fortunate at the CBC, but I'm conducting a national study, and I can tell you there are lots of major media employers who offer very little with regard to medical benefits for psychological counseling and coverage like that. Traditionally, it's been largely about counseling. There is a shift going on, and there are all sorts of other practices that we're now starting to explore.
So in your estimation, top-down approaches to addressing these issues are often not effective. Why not?
Well, okay, so I'm not sure we've had many top-down approaches, if I may. Like, this is back to something Cait said. A lot of the people who've grown up who are now the more senior editors and assignment desk and managers have grown up through journalism. And they get promoted because they're excellent journalists. I've come to say we're really good at managing stories, not so great at managing people, because we didn't spend our time learning people management. Nobody signed up thinking they had to be a mental health specialist, so we're not experts. Our organizations have had a duty, and so they've gone out and they've got EAPs and they've got some counseling services. But the thing that I'm finding is that a lot of those, though well-intentioned and to some degree helpful, they don't necessarily understand the working lives of journalists, the unique demands of, shift work, working overnight, the high pace, the rapid decision-making that gets made, the exposure to trauma stories day in and day out. And so one of the things that we're exploring at CBC, I can tell you just in recent weeks, we have arranged specialized counseling with a company that is working with some major players in, I'm thinking about Reuters around the world. I'm thinking about NPR, Al Jazeera. They have access to counselors who are actually trained, I call them journalism aware counseling. They're familiar with the industry enough that when somebody's struggling, a journalist, and needs counseling, they get on the phone, they don't have to explain, look, yes, this is the ridiculous work environment I work in. Yes, these are the bizarre, aspects of my job. I don't want to talk about that. I need to get through the next 24 to 48 hours. Can we talk about that, please? It sounds like a small thing, but it's really important that we start getting the mental health supports and the counseling services that are responsive to the unique needs of the news professional. So I'm really excited about that. That's a major thing and so your question is, top down. Look, I'm a senior journalist, so I'm sort of in the middle. I'm not a manager. I'm bringing to this exercise, trying to bring the goodwill of my colleagues along to meet with managers who want to do the right thing, but we're all looking to learn. And so I'm very optimistic about our situation, and I would encourage other newsrooms to try to cultivate champions within, because it will have great legitimacy if it's it doesn't have to be entirely employee led, but certainly employee engaged. Let's call it that.
Cait, from your vantage point, where do you see this sort of effort playing out next? Because all of this is happening at the same time that the profession is seeing a generational shift.
Look, I think what Dave speaks about, having journalists aware counsellors is really, really important. And I really applaud CBC for doing this. We've also got young people that are much more cognizant of mental health these days coming into the profession. So they're demanding more. So that sort of a resource is really important. I do talk about a top-down and a bottom-up approach within news organisations. And when I say top-down, it's about training managers about their duty of care responsibilities, really educating them and skilling them up to know how to support, what to say, even basic, giving them scripts in training. I've done that, of what to say if someone comes and says they're really struggling with depression or feeling suicidality. So what do you do in those scary conversations? So top down from that perspective, because the research shows us, as I said before, that if anyone, not just journalists, but military or whoever, if they are really well supported and feel that support by their organisation, they can deal with a lot of crap. But also a bottom up, where I talk about the importance of whether it be a formal peer support program or what I call a buddying system, where it's a sort of a peer light program, but where people are also given the skills to look out for their colleagues, how to pick up if someone's not travelling well. And again, what to do, not to feel awkward in terms of intervening. So I think it needs a whole system approach within news organisations, which is what I really advocate. And not a one size fits all, that organisations know that just because counselling works for someone, it may not work for another person. So there needs to be a lot of spokes in the wheel in terms of supporting people.
And just lastly, I want to ask you both, to those viewers and readers who feel very cavalier about confronting or attacking journalists, either in person or online, what would be your message to them, Dave?
Don't. Look, we're people. If you've got issues, look, I think criticism of the media is vital. I think the media has to be transparent and held to account. But that doesn't mean cutting people off in traffic or coming after them with sexual abuse live on television or filling their inbox with hateful racist messages. And that's the point that some of the extremes that we've gotten to. So here's what I would say. Look at a world that doesn't have a free media. And we can see that glaringly right now in the example of Russia. Is that the kind of information world that we want to live in? So people have to do their jobs. We play a very important function, and people should, even if you don't agree with the particular slant or the approach of the media organization, you have to understand that the people doing these jobs are doing it for the benefit of all of us. That's my view.
Cait, what would you say to that?
Look, I support Dave in totally. Just don't. And to think about the human that's there holding the microphone or behind the camera. Think of them as human beings. And also, as Dave says, it's important to question media, and I'm really enjoying the push-pull now that we do have the opportunity as audience to enter into a dialogue, but to think about, are you contributing to that dialogue or are you just being a jerk?
Well, a good note on which to end. That's all the time we have for today. So I'd like to thank Cait McMahon and Dave Seglins for being here today. And thanks to all of you for watching. You can find past episodes of Inside the Media on Facebook and YouTube. See you next time.